With their previous movie, I Saw the TV Glow, Jane Stromberg showed the impact that a cult television series could have on someone. And now with their newest movie, Teenage Sex and Death at Camp Miasma, they explore the effect of 80s slasher films, and from the opening titles, I was completely hooked into this satire on the horror film industry. Stromberg approaches this story with the assumption the audience will be familiar with these references, and then plays into that in so many funny and creative ways. And much like their previous film, it digs into our relationship with art, and why we find ourselves gravitating towards certain work. The movie seems to exist in its own world parallel to our own, particularly with how it tells us the backstory of this slasher franchise. Anyone familiar with series like Friday the 13th and The Nightmare on Elm Street will recognize what the in-universe Camp Miasma franchise is paying homage to, and the attention to detail with depicting its history is incredibly well done. There are so many clever little touches that play into our knowledge of the genre. Even casting Kevin McDonald as a hotel clerk is saying a lot about the way filmmakers approached horror in the 80s. Then there are the conversations that horror director Chris has with studio executives and her agent, which provide some of the funniest moments in the movie. Through its satire, the film addresses the modern perception of these movies and the aspects that invite a certain conversation through a modern lens. Camp Miasma is celebrating the impact these films have on pop culture, while also smartly addressing some of the messages they may have implanted. However, it does in a way that's thoughtful rather than grating. Then there are the scenes we actually see of the 80s movie Chris is remaking, which perfectly recreate that period in horror filmmaking. There's also a moment that flips things by depicting a typical slasher scene through the villain's point of view, which provides one of the highlights. Camp Miasma is more than just these homages and discussions of horror movies, though. One of the strongest aspects comes from the relationship that forms between Chris and former horror movie actress Billy Presley. It develops in a fascinating way that tells us so much about these two, and is further helped by the performances. Hannah Einbinder understands film's comic tone while also showing Chris's thought process as she decides how to proceed with this remake. Gillian Anderson is especially great, playing up the familiar trope of the reclusive former actress and absolutely digging into the role. Stromberg takes the story in some interesting directions, which I admittedly had to sit and think about for a while, but in the end came away being very impressed with the film's creativity. I think Teenage Sex and Death at Camp Miasma will most appeal to classic horror nerds, but there's more underneath the surface than just the homages. It's also really funny with a clever screenplay. I really admire the great little details that Stromberg peppers throughout the film in both the dialogue and the production design. One of the film's strengths is even the way it returns to things that you might think would only be important in a single scene. But overall, it seems to come from a place of love, from pursuing the horror section of the video store and seeing those freaky covers with mass killers.